episode 3 of the Spinoza Triad, in which Dan Rowlands, John Gibbs, and Richard Miller investigate, discuss, and think about contemporary issues, popular culture, and big philosophical ideas. This week, taking the film V for Vendetta as a starting point, we managed to consider the ethics of violence, Zizek's critique of the left, archetypes, narrative structures, the Frankfurt School, and I even managed to incorporate some repressive desublimation. We begin with considering V for Vendetta and its representation of archetype. Which takes us a little bit back to last week and conspiracy theories. The hero, V, is uncovering a dastardly plot. He's been experimented on in the past by possibly well-meaning scientists allied to very unwell-meaning people who are trying to make biological weapons. And the biological weapon they produce is a virus that they also have the cure for. And so they come up with a plot to release the virus into the British population, kill a bunch of people, kills 100,000 people, but that's a plot in order that they can come along with the cure, and the cure is also an authoritarian regime. So this sort of fascist party takes control.
The North Fire Party.
The North Fire Party, and they, led by John Hurt, the Chancellor. Adam Sattler is the sort of big brother character, but basically he's a big brother character. He takes over the country. So when you join the film, as it were, 14 years or so since the events of the virus, they are under the heel of an authoritarian regime, very big brother-esque, very proto-fascist, and somehow he's one of the experimental victims of this original experiment. But it has given him remarkable powers. He's also appears to have come through an episode of being burned alive. The burning has done something very symbolic to him in a way, and so he's come out the other side with super quick reactions, martial arts skills you wouldn't believe, and a list of people he's going to kill. So he basically kills, has vengeance on a number of people.
Sounds like a plan. Yeah.
And then on November the 5th, he tells the country he's going to do this. He's going to blow up Parliament on November the 5th. He gets loads of masks to people. So the people wearing the very iconic, because since that film was made, it's had a life of its own in not only internet activism, but also activism. So the masks, he distributes the masks and crowds turn up to Parliament, and the film, if you're listening to this, the spoiler's coming. The film ends with Parliament being exploded and a revolution taking place. He dies, but presumably the regime has been overcome as crowds and crowds of mask-wearing people surge into Parliament to have the revolution. Going to last week's discussion about archetypes, this film is full of them. Not only is V himself an archetypal hero in the sense that he can lead you to the promised land but can never get there himself. He has to have suffered in order to see the truth, and he has to lead people into a kind of suffering to see the truth. All these are resonant of numerous other heroic figures. I was thinking of Gladiator. Gladiator has to die before you hand on, and because if V were to become the leader of the revolution, or if Maximus were to become the new emperor, they'd be even worse than the ones who've just gone. So that idea that in order for the hero to lead you to the revolution, they have to become tarnished by the very forces they're trying to overcome. In fact, they have to use the violence against the regime, and so they can't go through. They have to, like Moses, they can't enter the promised land. They have to die before you get there. So in order to lead you there, the use of violence excludes the hero from actually partaking of the paradise he's led up to. At the end of the film, Shane, the great 1950s Western, Shane kills all the villains, but has to go off. They say, settle down with us and become a farmer. And Shane says, no, I can't do that. I'm a gunman. That means I can never settle and never be happy.
Looking at that hero's journey as well, it's that book Joseph Campbell on A Hero of a Thousand Faces. And that's got the initiation, the return, quite similar to the V story here. I'm just thinking of the character Evie. He comes on, he's almost like a Yoda character, isn't he, in some respects? V, try and get her to reborn again.
Yeah, he's also the wizard, isn't he? He's the wise guide. He knows the truth, has to reveal it to Evie.
And a bit where she's being interrogated, and it's a bit like sort of Christ's temptation or the Rocky training montage, or, it's a bit where she's created again, she dies to herself. So Zizek's book, Fragile Absolute, and that sort of period of his stuff, where he's quite interested in ethics and the ethical act proper. He takes these Christian narratives and he has an atheist reading of Christianity. And one of his points is about how it's against utilitarian and against Kantian to move beyond Kant, that he tries to sort of formulate this idea of total death to yourself. If V was to kill himself or die or sacrifice himself in order for something else, it would be what he calls a passing of the act, not an act proper. If you are then to die to yourself with no guarantee, he calls this as a sort of an ethical act proper, and he takes Christ as a model of this. Evie has almost the same moment. You see V when he's burning and his hands are out, again, almost quite Christ-like again, and she does the same thing, doesn't she? And she's born again as this character who doesn't really care now because she's died to herself.
I really like that idea, the theme through the film of rebirth, of the purifying fire, the awakening to the new world, and starting again, very much a Christian idea. The recontracting between man and God, the new world that Christ offers, the restart, as it were, the hit the reset button Christianity offers in the New Testament. Problem for Christianity, it seems to me, the ethical act proper is rather open-ended. It's more of a gateway, more of an invitation, more of a possibility than any kind of resolution. It's never dead clear whether the city of God lies now or in the future, is somehow to be brought about by man in some process after Christ. So Christ's sacrifices with apparently lot to do for mankind still, and the city of God again lies somewhere uncertain. Might be a good moment to deal with some of the slightly problematic elements in the film. And I think one of them is the persistent rescuing of Evie. I mean, she's rescued initially from representations of a very archetypal caricatures of the working class. For reasons that don't entirely make sense and aren't explained, Evie is wandering the darkened streets after curfew when she encounters these figures. And these are the fingermen. And the fingermen, I think, the fingermen must come from the old British idea of being fingered by the police, being fingered by fingers. Anyway, these guys are like, right, come here, Missy, you're certainly not going anywhere, you pretty young thing. And you think, oh, yes, well, of course. And then when V shows up, he is debonair, he is suave, he talks in alliterative V, and he's amusing, and he's clever, and he's gentlemanly. So he's the gentleman saviour of the young lady. He saves her from that occasion. The oiky working class blokes are chased off into the wilderness. Then he rescues her again. When he carries out a killing of another chap, he rescues her at the end. Actually, she's not unconscious, he's rescued. I thought, how many times is this young woman going to be rescued? It was her main purpose. And then, not only has he rescued her a couple of times, but then he has to lead her out of her foolish misunderstanding.
But doesn't she represent the average citizen then, being rescued? Could you argue this film is off the right, really, currently? Because it's looking at an oppressive state, putting liberalism at the heart of everything and the individual at the heart of everything, and nothing should compromise what the individual wants. And perhaps the Evie being rescued is the stranglehold of the state.
Oh yeah, I think in hindsight, I think you can see this as a parable of leftist revolution and liberal revolution. There's a bit later in the film where a lesbian couple are brutally dealt with. Evie discovers a note in her cell, and she's able to, therefore, that gives the film the opportunity to go into a flashback of a kind of bucolic, new age idyll where a lesbian couple live in a sort of sapphic paradise. It's all very ecologically friendly. They live in the countryside. It's delightful. It's very middle class, very beautiful. And these are going to be roughly dealt with. And so clearly you realize you're on the side of the ethics of liberalism. But equally, in the film as a whole, the sort of violence that's used, the conspiracy theory that's suggested, could equally appeal to the people charging up the steps of Congress, a couple of months ago. They believe themselves to be liberated. They believe they're standing up against the big state. So it's a film against the big state, fascistic in nature. Talk show host Americans call Barack Obama a fascist. I was just going to say about the Evie character. She does, I think, unfortunately, rather problematically, become a male fantasy of rescue. because, as you say, symbolically, there's a pain that has to be put through. You have to put her through the agonies. Couldn't you have just sat her down and had a bit of a talk about the true nature of the regime? But no.
The ethical move, though, is that you have to go through some form of suffering. That's that the archetypes we spoke about last week, isn't it? That you have to go through something in order to be reborn, and it has to be painful. You have to go through some kind of hard work and
I find that idea unappealing. The kind of idea of the purifying nature of pain, And I feel it does appeal to a certain fascistic right-wing element.
All the way through the film, you see people staring at the news, and they know very well that it's not true, but we'll watch it anyway. And it's that kind of critique of mass culture that you are passive, you absorb, and you're controlled, but they know that they are as well. And V offers a rupture, a break from that through sort of high culture. So V is surrounded by opera and theatre and books and literature, this kind of thing, and you can have freedom through these high cultural products, as opposed to if you were a dummy of the masses that just watches TV.
I thought that was very prescient, the sort of fake news. So the regime, every time he bombs something, they say it was an accident, or when he bombed something, it was evil terrorists. So the regime manipulates the media and fake news. However, you're absolutely right, Richard. The populace in the film, as they're represented, and they seem to be mainly middle-class English people, sitting on rather well upholstered sofas. Apart from the leering finger men and some odd guys in a bar, mostly it's sort of middle class people sitting in sort of nicely middle class English living rooms who look at the television and say things like, well, that's a load of rubbish then. So while there's lots of fake news going out there, proletariat, the middle class proletariat, you appear to be able to see through it very, very easily. The other thing that struck me, Richard, what you were saying there is I thought I was thinking of the sort of Frankfurt School ideas.
Yeah. It sets almost like a checklist of the sort of Frankfurt School arguments. You got that society's repressive and that mass culture works to repress people, that high culture will offer you a way out through not critically engaging with the sort of social world around you. I was trying to find if I could fit repressive desublimation in there, John, but no, but I couldn't.
The only hint I got of the repressive desublimation was you see a brief bit where she goes into one of the buildings and the security man is watching something called Laser Girl. And when the satirist, played by Stephen Fry, does a satirical show, it has a lot of girls in swimming costumes dancing around at one point, and there's a bit of Benny Hill music being played. And I thought, well, so that's the only hint to suggestion of the using sexual kind of imagery in order to desublimate, to repress. I mean, I thought that there wasn't a lot of that, but I didn't think it was, other than that, very, very Frankfurt School.
Yeah.
What about the threat of violence and the use of violence? Because V is coming up with these wonderful ideas about, the individual and liberalism, and, is willing to use acts of terrorism, which sits totally against, when was it written? When was it produced? 2005. So it's almost at the height of the war on terrorism.
That idea of the repressive nature of popular culture is better dealt with in films like Network. What's the guy's name?
Where the guy's shouting out of the window saying switch it off or something?
Yeah, I'm as mad as hell and I can't take this anymore. Switch off your television. Switch off your television. Yeah, that one. What this film I thought was very strong, as is Watchmen. You've seen Watchmen.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
Watchmen is presenting a moral question. I think, Dan, you have the heart of this film. Really. The moral question is, when is it right to use violence? Can a repressive regime justify violent reaction, or the possibility or the expectation of collateral damage?
And how a film ideologically frames those questions, doesn't it, as well? Because it seems okay for V to go around, hack a bit to death with swords or knives and then blowing up the government.
Exactly, yeah.
And it's not exactly the democratic process, was it?
With acts of terrorism against SS officers or, Bonhoeffer, what's our moral take on that?
Well, I think that is the big question,
isn't it?
It is the question of the film, is if you could blow up the train and kill the orphans, the trainload of orphans, you're going to blow up the trainload of orphans because Adolf Hitler's on board. and it'll prevent
utilitarian argument, yeah,
for the greater good, for the greatest number. And so it's posing that dilemma.
It's quite a simple moral response to a complex idea, isn't it? Just utilitarianism.
The film is slightly problematic in its presentation of violence. Not only is the violence slightly voyeuristic, there's lots of slow motion blood spurting and very swift knife use.
I love that. Go on, get him.
The knives sort of move almost lasciviously through the air, and then embed themselves in the middle of someone's forehead. There's something enjoy the violence. The violence is also sanitized. Although he kills people with spurting blood and gushing, they are the bad people he kills. When he blows up, first of all, he blows up the Old Bailey, and then later on he blows up Parliament. You presume, or do you, that there are no innocent people who happen to have been around that area. When you blow up Parliament, was there like a caretaker? Had they thought, and all the policemen that get killed or blown up or killed, are they just not victims of the system as well? You have to have a very clear idea.
They're running around fingering people, John.
Well, the fingermen are they're morally depraved. I thought the most ludicrous figure was the paedophile bishop.
Yeah.
Let us conjure someone we'll quite enjoy seeing killed.
Yeah. What about the mask? I didn't know if there was any mileage at all with because he has an idea, doesn't he? He says throughout the film, it's you can't beat an idea, and he's obviously the representation of that idea. That sort of Lacanian idea that fantasy keeps at a distance from the thing itself that you can never know. He alludes to that idea, doesn't he? He doesn't sort of map out his manifesto as such, does he? He's just an idea.
And you're left thinking, what is the main idea of the film? What is it really about, except the classic fighting against a totalitarian state? This is where Slavoj Zizek says that he would sell his own mother to see the part 2 of this film, because he says that the point of it is that we don't know what the people do with the freedom that they've achieved and what kind of new society do they form.
I mean, I can remember this when I was a student, and I went along to Workers' Revolutionary Party meetings.
Right.
What's those cartoons where someone says some dreadful faux pas, and it's like the man who said, "Can I have a second helping of shrimp or something?" And the whole restaurant is all falling apart, fainting. They used to appear in the Daily Mail. Anyway, it was like that. If you were at a leftist meeting and you said something like, "Well, what's our program for government?" The thing you must never say. But that was after the revolution. What does a socialist society look like? How is equality achieved? What do we mean by equality? None of those questions. It had to always be about the nature of the revolution and the failures of capitalism itself.
But it's a bit like that with Zizek anyway, isn't it? Because I don't know, got that ethical model he talks about, this idea of a death to yourself that cannot have any guarantees. So almost like a sort of radical responsibility to die to yourself, to be born again. But I'm not aware of anywhere where Zizek actually says, I mean, that very critique that he has of the left should be launched at him as well. He never says in any view, does he, of how he would map out a socialist, or a collective, or a bit like V, really. Perhaps Zizek is V.
Well,
he could be.
It's very
boring rhetoric.
He doesn't say and so on enough, though, does he?
So on, no, yeah.
He doesn't do this with his nose either.
Yeah, can I reach it? Because his mask's on.
Actually, maybe that's the mask.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I feel with this film. There's a lack of a centre to it. Too many themes and not enough central.
Oh, completely. It's a parable of a very limited kind. But it does. I think the big question it asks about violence. We'll come back to that in a minute. But if you said, well, what kind of world would V want? Well, it's clearly got a lot of art in it. His underground lair is full of art, and these are all he says. Well, these have been stolen from the banned art. So, like the Nazis had undesirable art. But if you look at V's lair, it's kind of Renaissance art and every kind of art you can imagine. So clearly the fascists that John Hurt's in charge of really just don't like art. They're really against all forms of art.
Yeah, so the essence of art, really good art, is trying to capture something which is beyond reach.
Well, yes. Well, twice in the film, a character says, "Art lies to you in order to tell you the truth. Power of art is in its illusory capacity to take you to places you didn't think you were going to go. I mean, it's what the Frankfurt School, I think, used to call the antagonistic, disruptive power of art. So that great art is more revealing to you and reveals the truth of things. Very romantic idea in a way that popular culture doesn't. That simply distracts you. That's simply bread and circus.
That's a great point.
But it's the assumption, though, that there can't be art within popular culture. I mean, that's the problem, isn't it, with both this film and the Frankfurt School in general, I think.
He's V is very highbrow.
Yeah, he is, isn't he? Yeah.
In that way that the old Soviet Union used to be obsessively highbrow. And he would insist that the proletariat, the working classes of the new Soviet Union, back in the 1950s and 60s, propaganda would always have it. The working classes of the Soviet Union enjoyed ballet and poetry and opera, unlike the decadent West with its Western music, rock and roll and jazz, sort of romantic of what they were.
And then you kind of understand the higher purpose of life because you've indulged in these high arts and you have no problem with sacrifice because, you understand the meaning of it. I mean, when you think about various narratives around at the moment and what we've just been through, and then look at that film, it's the central sort of story of it in terms of governments and virus and control of the media and the way we engage with the media. Dan, I agree with you though. It flirts with a lot of ideas, but doesn't go into a massive amount of depth with any single one.
V is a revolutionary, and he says governments should be afraid of their people. Violence is sometimes necessary.
Yeah.
Effectively, what he's saying for is the good terrorist is okay, because as anyone knows, the problem with terrorism is it's telling them apart from who is the terrorist, who is the freedom fighter. Thinking this week about the trial in the United States of Derek Chauvin. One of the things the trial had to do, in a way, was insist, and it's probably very good tactics for the prosecution of Derek Chauvin, was insist that Derek Chauvin was just an evil, bad policeman. We had the testimony that worked most effectively was other policemen saying that he behaved beyond the pale here. This was not what he was trained to do. This was grotesque. It was awful. It was terrible. And in a sense, America was sort of reassuring itself, because I listened to a lot of people saying America's regained some self-respect. I feel more proud of America. And it was indeed an unusual moment, because here's a trial of a man when normally policemen in situations like this get off. But in order to convict him, the police themselves weren't the problem.
You had to be separated from the institution.
And separate them from the institution.
It was just a bad egg.
It's the bad egg. And indeed, Derek Chauvin himself his defense don't decide to argue. I'm as much a victim of this as anyone. I mean, that would be a tough one to follow. But he could argue he's up for his own victimhood in the sense that how many necks has he lent on? Loads. And they didn't die. He's got away with it. And how many necks are being lent on across America and people don't die or being shot and without cameras? He could say, not only am I perpetrating the violence that's inherent in the system, and I'm a product of the racism of the system, I'm also very unlucky to have been caught. And all those things are true.
Which shows the power of the way in which conversation goes and what can be said and what can't be said.
And what can't be said, most obviously, is the thing which is most obvious, is that violence is more characterized by its systemic nature than its individualized nature. It is a part of society. It is all around us. It is incorporated into our culture. And one of the functions, in a sense, of fiction, of representations such as the film V, is to make a hero who individualizes violence. It's what Zizek makes the distinction between subjective and objective violence. And our society resists the idea of objectification of violence, that it is a thing, that violence is incorporated culturally, historically, sociologically around us, and instead is in the hands of the individual. It's the person who presses the trigger. It's the one who wields the knife. It's the person kneeling on the neck. They draw away all the horrible possibility that violence is something that we are a part of. I mean, Zizek tells this joke. It's a particularly funny joke. I came across a Zizek joke. Apparently Zizek likes this joke. There are two men watching a play in a theatre, and one has to go to the loo, so he excuses himself. He works his way out through the audience. And his friend, before he goes, the man next to him says, "Oh, the loo is just down the corridor." He heads down the corridor through the dark theatre, can't find it, keeps looking for the loo, he's getting lost. He finds a door, goes through it, nothing in the room, but there's a potted plant. So he's desperate to go to the loo now. He urinates copiously into the potted plant, goes back, finds his way back up the corridor, back to his seat, sneaks along back to his seat, sits down. His friend whispers to him, "Ah, it's a pity. You missed the best bit of the play. Some guy just came on stage and urinated in a potted plant." And the idea of that joke is that we resist the idea that we are part of the performance. The fiction is distant, is not part of us. The violence we see on the news is fictionalized. We are not part of it. And this is very different. This post-Enlightenment sanitizing of violence, the individuation of violence, is part of our culture. I don't think it was such true of classical culture. I mean, the classic cultures in Greece, or certainly in Greece, or indeed in Scandinavian culture, they knew about blood feuds. They knew about grudges passing on down generations. They knew about the crime that led to the inevitable destruction. They knew that violence was organic and not subjective. And that's what this film most urgently does. But there is really no justification. All freedom fighting, all attempts to put right social justice can never be fully justified by any kind of that can never justify absolutely any kind of violence. Because violence, even if it's killing one person, is an absolute, a complete moral absolute. So you could say that's categorical imperative. Simply shouldn't do that. And then I imagine a sort of thought experiment where you said to the Sinn Féin people or the IRA, if you've got the IRA leadership, the mid-1970s, and said, what I'd like you to do is write on a piece of paper your wish list. Everything you'd most want. You can have a united Ireland. You can have Sinn Féin in charge of the government. You can have Mrs. Thatcher and all the Tory leaders and an establishment in Britain led through Dublin starkers, have people shouting shame at them. You can have what you like, your wish list. You have everything the IRA are currently fighting for and believe is most unjust. You have Protestants removed from Northern Ireland. You have what you like. Write it down here, your complete victory of your cause. But in return, what you must do, then you bring in a small child. Bring in the child. Little girl, say. You sit her down on a chair, and you fire up a blow lamp. And what you've got to do is you've got to kill that child with this blow lamp. It's going to be agony. It's going to be burning.
John. Honestly.
The eyeballs bubbling. It's going to be an awful...
Some thought experiment, John, yeah.
Yeah. If you have the courage to do that, I'll give you your victory. Because after all, your bombs, they presumably do that. It's just you're not there to see it.
Yeah.
Good point.
Oh, yeah. Drop a bomb over Berlin in the Second World War. When you drop a bomb over Hanoi, you presumably have to accept the possibility, although, you say, well, that might be the defense. Well, I'm not killing that child because that's a certain death. Whereas
non-intentional.
But it's unintentional. Well, okay, then I'll alter my thought experiment. In this case, I'll flip a coin.
Collateral damage.
And if you get a heads, the child dies a horrible, agonizing, burned to death death, and tails, she survives. Are you willing
Well, that makes it even worse.
Yeah, always even worse, because that's absolving you to some extent.
No, that makes this, that is a much more accurate thought experiment for state policy, isn't it? Because when they say collateral damage, it's just part of war. The cause is good, but we will have collateral damage using that.
Collateral damage, yeah. Or if the person pressing the button, dropping the bomb over Berlin in World War II, or over Hanoi, or firing a missile into Israel, or firing a rocket back into the Gaza Strip, that person says, well, there's a chance, I can pretend that it doesn't kill a child. And if it did, that wasn't my intention. That's almost worse.
Would an act of violence be acceptable then? I say, so apply that an act of violence towards an SS officer, like, the Christian Bonhoeffer, where he could be a successful terrorist against the Nazis. Is that subject to moral blame? I suppose that's the question I'm asking.
Well, according to Kant, it would be. Yeah, that thought experiment, Kant's famous thought experiment, if the Axeman turns up at your front door wanting to kill the man who's sitting in the living room,
you must tell him where he is.
You must tell him that he's sitting in the living room, because you can't know that he might, until he actually has killed him, you don't know he will. if your friend runs out the back door and he kills him there, well, that's happened anyway, but it wasn't you that was involved in a lie. And if by saying the lie, the Axeman goes away and kills his Auntie Flo and his two children, you've actually, the consequence, the only thing you can know is that lying was the thing you were in control of. Killing the dictator, shoot Hitler, but you have to know the future, which we can never know. You have to know, in order to kill Hitler on that train, you have to have known the future.
Isn't the message of this film, though, with V, it's more about violence to yourself, isn't it? It's about self-sacrifice. The absolute, if you like, is about he dies for the greater good.
Having taken quite a few down with him as well.
Yeah. Only those Fingerman. The Book of Eli. Have you seen that?
The guys trying to sellotape the Bible back together again.
Yeah, and he's memorised. No, there's some proper violence in that.
Something, yeah.
He kills loads of people with a knife as well, with a bit like V.
Yeah, in a nasty way. Yeah.
Big knife, yeah, and he kills all these people, and you find out at the end it's because he's the only person that's memorised the New Testament. But I thought that was quite interesting. Again, it's how it's ideologically framed. And you don't question that at all, isn't it? You just think, yes, good old Eli knows the Bible.
So you quite enjoy the sort of vicarious idea of the killing, the cat killing of these bad guys, the bad guys. So you enjoy the killing, but you have to say, well, what V doesn't like about the regime is their brutal killing. He says, I can't die because my idea won't die. Yeah. The idea is the mask. So they all put the mask on. So V lives on in his idea. Well, if that's true, then that leads you back to problem of the left. If it's the idea that's going to beat the regime, it didn't maybe need all that killing. Or what is the killing? It's the killing in order to reveal to people the idea, or the idea of emerged anyway, in which case, say, don't kill people, just let the idea emerge. And it's that old Menshevik-Bolshevik argument. Will revolution take place organically? People will eventually. The regime presumably is so appalling and so awful. It already appears that the people are pretty self-aware. They already appear to have achieved a level of consciousness. Every time the regime shows propaganda, people are going, oh, that's a load of rubbish, or I don't believe that. Well, really, V, you could just leave them alone. They're seeing their way through this fairly adequately.
No, you could argue, again, is they got used to a sense of comfort and a sense of enjoyment. So, yes, lies were being told, but their pursuit of enjoyment was a lie in itself, and they were quite content, as we are today, to keep pursuing enjoyment. Else. We don't have any causes anymore. Politically, we don't talk about causes. We just talk about individual comfort, individual rights. Political action has rescinded since the 1960s. Students don't get out and protest about the Vietnam. They were protesting about the Vietnam War and all sorts of things, civil rights. So there's a lack of big causes anymore, and so that might explain why all the middle class people are sitting at home listening to the lies from the government, but accepting them through just complaining privately.
Lacanian enjoyment, there's that level of it. It's that pleasure and pain, isn't it? The enjoyment of the rules. I remember one of the Zizek books where he critiques the argument about the banality of evil with the Nazis, and he says, in actual fact, it wasn't a banality of evil. There was an obsession with order and paperwork and uniforms. That's at the level of enjoyment. It was in that. So yeah, enjoyment's working on sort of different levels within that process. Psychoanalytic enjoyment in that, isn't there?
Could you argue that we've lost the mask, and it was the mask that allowed society to operate? Nobody needs to wear a mask anymore because they're only concerned about themselves and their own thoughts and feelings, especially with the internet. And so V here is saying, put the mask back on and reject this society of enjoyment. The responsibility you have towards other people rather than just yourself.
Yeah, I think, Dan, that's very interesting you could say that, because I think, again, we were saying earlier, if V has an ideology, it appears to be the ideology of culture. It's about an ideology of high culture. And so, right, in the V-constructed world, whatever that might be, there's almost no idea what that would be. Mm. But what the V-constructed world might be would certainly be a world of, as you say, order and politeness and tradition and concepts of that time. Because the regime he's currently in, presumably, the regime led by John Hurt, the great dictator, the dictator is trying to impose order in a similar sort of way. the odd paradox of the old Soviet Union was they believed in high culture for the workers, but they were themselves quite brutal and grotesque and wasteful. A society of order and civility. the world of civility and politeness ends up brutally punishing people because of their lack of civility. Do people want to be liberated in our society from a society of consumerism? It's like the left's problem with trying to find the authentically alienated working class. The authentically alienated working class don't appear to be in Britain. Most people have never lived lives of such wealth. If you go onto the streets and say, I'll save you, comrade, from this oppression, and say, well, actually,
what's he talking about?
I've got a much better life than my parents, and their parents had a much better life than them. Capitalism keeps on delivering. Yeah, and it won't happen because if a terrorist blows up a bomb in London, or the House of Parliament for that matter, all sorts of people over the country are going to say, well, goodness me, we've been leading lives of vacuous consumerism.
What were we thinking?
Yeah. What were we thinking of? That won't.
Stupid.
You have been listening to the unscripted discussions of the Spinoza Triad, Dan Rowland, John Gibbs, and Richard Miller. I hope you enjoyed it. Next week, we shall be attempting to look at modern-day consumerism, but not through the eyes of postmodernism, Marxism, the Frankfurt School, but instead through Hellenistic philosophy, Stoicism, Cynicism, and Epicureanism. Follow the link to my website, The Politics Shed, to leave comments, suggestions for future podcasts. Thank you.